Welcome to our fourth and last lecture of collective learning, collective care that responds to our current mode of social distancing and distance learning in the light of a broader socio-political context regarding the value of care work and the realm of collective experience. As a result of the arrangements introduced to tackle COVID-19, some of us are or have been experiencing social distancing, distance learning, separation and isolation in a number of environments. At first glance, it might seem that one can talk about a we, us, even a collective moment. But after all we have seen and experienced in drawing on my work as a lecturer too, however, I do not agree with this viewpoint. At a time of drastic restrictions to individual freedom of movement in public spaces, the widely differing options to deal with this uncertain situation are becoming especially clear. Women, people of color, and minorities are suffering. On a fundamental level, this situation has demonstrated which work our societies rely on, namely on the so-called system relevant and reproductive labor, or in other words, care work that still is undervalued. This exceptional situation again illustrates something that feminist Silvia Federici, one of the founders of the International Feminist Collective, have been demanding since the 70s with their campaign Wages for Housework. They call for recognition of reproductive labor as labor. In her latest book, Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, Rethinking, Remaking, and Reclaiming the Body in Contemporary Capitalism, Federici looks at the different manifestations of the body as a ground of confrontation with the state and a vehicle for transformative social practices. Quote, concurrently, the body has become a signifier for the reproduction crisis the neoliberal turn in capitalist development has generated and for the international surge in institutional repression and public violence. Today, I'm very happy to welcome Silvia Federici, who is Emerita Professor at Hofstra University, Hempstead, New York. Her field of research is political philosophy and women's studies. She has also contributed various essays on educational and cultural politics. From 1991 to 2003, after a period of teaching at the University of Port Harcourt in Nigeria, she was a co-founder of the Committee of Academic Freedom in Africa and co-editor of the CIFA Bulletin. From 1995 to 2002, she has also helped found the Anti-Death Penalty Project of the US-based Radical Philosophy Association. Her published work include Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body and Primitive Accumulation, Revolution at Point Zero, Housework, Reproduction and Feminist Struggles, 8,000 Flowers, Social Struggles Against Structural Adjustment in African Universities, Enduring Western Civilization, the Construction of the Concept of the West and its Others. So today I welcome Silvia Federici for her presentation here.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you all in the audience. It's a really great pleasure for me to be able to communicate with you, particularly at this time in which, after months of being confined to our homes, to be able to communicate broadly across the ocean. It's really a pleasure and a great honor. I want to talk a bit in my 30 minutes presentation, about the question of the crisis, the body crisis, the crisis of reproduction that has been so dramatically manifested by this global pandemic. To say that what this pandemic has demonstrated, or what it has shown to us, it's a crisis that it's structural, intrinsic to the whole organization of reproduction in capitalist society. In other words, we have been in crisis for a long time. That crisis has taken many different forms, and clearly it's reaching a peak today. We are actually facing for the first time, the possibility of a massive, massive, destruction of life, even though the history of capitalism is also a history of destruction. But we are facing again this possibility today. So I want to start by looking at reproduction, the body as terrain of crisis for women, but also not only for women, for population that capitalism has exploited since its the beginning of its development. As we know, as the feminist movement has so powerfully denounced and illustrated, reproduction has been a terrain of crisis, especially for women, since the beginning of capitalism, because as a kind of labor, it has been completely devalued. One of the characteristics, one of the most important developments, in the capitalist takeoff, has been, in fact, a reorganization of the work of production and reproduction, where the two have become more and more separated. And where the production for the market, for production of commodity, of goods, has been recognized as labor, the daily reproduction of life, procreation, sexual activity, cleaning, raising children, cooking, all of this, which is really the support, the basic support of human life, has been increasingly hidden, described as a non-economic activity, non-work, has been increasingly feminized and naturalized. Naturalized in the sense that it has been increasingly presented, imposed as a natural attribute, vocation of women, and not as a particular form of social labor. And with this has gone the fact that this work has never been seen worthy of any remuneration, has never been seen worthy of the same social recognition, limited as may have been, that has accompanied, the development of wage work. And in fact, this work has been completely invisibilized. I think it was one of the merit and the revolutionary aspect of the feminist movement in the 70s, to have exposed this situation and to have, in fact, begun the kind of analysis that has changed our understanding of what reproductive work, care work is about. Because out of the analysis that we have made, we have come to the conclusion that, in fact, this housework that has been made so invisible, that has been so devalued, even by the organization of the left, like the socialist parties, by the Marxist organization, in fact, it's probably the most important activity, not only for our life, but also for the continuation of the capitalist system, because it is not a personal service, but is in fact a form of production, except that it does not produce commodities, goods, but it produces laborers. It produces the laborer's capacity to work. In other words, that under the guise of housework, family, marriage, love, etc., what has been taking place has been a massive organization of production, which is the production of the workforce. So this is, for us, was really a great discovery. And, it came from a lot of personal experiences from our own life, by watching the life of our mother, thinking of the history of women in capitalism. And out of this recognition, we started a whole analysis of what is wage work, how the wage hides entire areas of exploitation. The wage in capitalism is not only a form of payment, is also a form of hiding other work that, because it's not wage, does not appear as work. And it's a way also, the wage of dividing people, creating hierarchies, wage worker, unwaged, enslaved. So that, for example, enslaved laborers are not seen as crucial, or they have not been seen historically as crucial to the production of capitalist society as industrial workers. And the same is true, of course, for women as house workers. We were always told that our work was marginal, that our work was not as important. And of course, that meant that in order to survive, in many cases, we had to depend on men for our survival. So we began to look also at the question of the body and realize that the kind of exploitation the women have been subjected to has affected their body much more deeply than men, because the state has taken over, capital, the state have taken over the bodies of women, our procreative capacity, our reproductive capacity, and turn our bodies into, as I often written, machines for the production of labor power. Machine, why? For example, all the legislation that has forbidden abortion. Why the state to be so interested in forbidding abortion if they were not concerned, with the product? And so women have been forced to procreate against their will, or punished if they engage in abortion, or they have been sterilized because the state wants to decide who can live, who can die, who should die, who can reproduce himself, herself, who cannot. And of course, all the regulation about sexuality, all the regulation about gender, the binary, the fact that you have to be a woman or have to be a man, the fact that after you're born, if your gender is not clear, you are immediately subjected to surgery. This is what has been happening now for many, many years. Now we have an intersex movement that is fighting against it. But until now, it was a compulsion to be either a man or a woman. And these are work conditions. This is part of the analysis, part of the investigation, the redefinition that we have done has been also to expose that gendering, the gendering process is very connected with the sexual division of labor. And that the regulation of women's sexuality, women's body, women's procreation is very much connected to the fact that capitalism is a system that nourishes itself out of the exploitation of human labor. And so the production of the worker is extremely important. And the body of women is crucial. It's a crucial instrument of that production. So the procreation has been appropriated, redefined by capitalism, as a economic activity, and subjected, a form of production, is subjected to all kinds of controls. So I think this is the background. This is the background to the points that I want to make about the present, to the struggle that have taken place and the present with the pandemic. In the 1970s and 80s, the women's movement, or a large part of the women's movement proposed in a way to go beyond this situation, to fight against this devaluation and this confinement, right? This confinement to housework, to an activity that's been completely naturalized, right? By going outside the home, fighting to assume to take wage work, entering into the area traditionally dominated, by men, with the argument that, the fact that we have been confined to the home has been the cause of the lack of power that we have had. And, many of us, saw this strategy as not sufficient. We argue that unless we dealt with the question of reproduction, unless we dealt with the devaluation, and unless we fought against the devaluation of reproduction, we will not be able to have any social power wherever we'll go, no matter what we would do. I think that the last 40 years, have shown that we were right. Because today in the United States and in Europe, for example, the majority of women work outside the home. And nevertheless, the majority of women have not been able, and here certainly I can speak very, very confidently about the United States. The majority of women have not been able to achieve the kind of autonomy and well-being that was associated, with going out of the home, leaving the home, and taking on jobs that were seen as paid, better paid, and more creative, and giving us a different social life. What we have seen instead has been the growth on the majority, for the majority of women, of a kind of life where every day is consumed by work, anxiety, preoccupation about the future. Because women have entered the so-called workplace. I say so-called because the house is a workplace. They have entered in the moment in which all the benefits associated with wage labor were being taken away. They have entered into a wage labor completely precarious and paid at the most minimal level. So they often have to have 2-3 jobs, and they often have to take on a debt. There are many women in the United States who, the day they receive the salary, they use the salary to take on a loan. They use the salary to take on a loan because they cannot support themselves or their family with the salary that they are earning. So we have the women who are, in fact, consumed by work, anxiety about the future, because so many jobs are daily restructured, brought outside the country, and so forth. And on the reproduction level, an immense crisis. A crisis that has many faces, has many forms. First of all, much of the labor the women used to do in the home is now being transferred on the shoulder of migrant women. Migrant women who come from countries that have been impoverished by the process of globalization, by all the austerity programs that have been forced upon African countries, Latin America, in the name of the debt crisis. So forced to migrate, and migrate to take on domestic work to make it possible for women in certain parts of the world to go out and work for a wage, but for a wage that never really, enabled the majority. I say the majority because clearly there are a select group of women who have basically improved their situation. But this is not as a result of the struggle of the feminist movement. But this has not really been the case for the majority. And I believe it has to do with the fact that we have not really resolved the question of reproduction. so that reproduction, even before the COVID-19, has been a place of crisis. Because what has been happening has been either the transfer of this work, on migrant women who themselves have had to leave their children in their countries, or live in Europe, in the US, under very, very precarious conditions, particularly if they are not fully documented, right? And open to all kinds of abuses. And here it's, with more time, there's a lot more to say. Or women have reduced the housework, and has not been able to provide care to the people, those who are older and not self-sufficient, or care to their children, or care in general to their families, and have not been able to organize the kind of division of labor, because in many cases the family has fallen apart. With the restructuring of industrial work, many families have broken up because the male wage has dissipated. So we had a situation really of intense crisis. I could give the statistics. In the United States over the last few years, it has been the number of people of suicide, of young children who are on pills, antidepressive pills for hyperactivity, 8 million children classified as having mental problem, which is a way of medicalizing a situation of, malaise, a situation in which children are really not, that basically not enough resources and attention is paid to them. The nursing home, to which more and more elder people are being confined, even before the COVID-19, were already places of disaster places, where often people were tied up to their bed, given tranquilizers, because no resources were really put at the surface of these places. I can come back to this question, but I think that what COVID-19 has shown, COVID-19 has brought the spotlight to a terrain that was already a terrain of crisis, has intensified crises that were already there, with children, with elder people, with the whole system of healthcare and reproduction. And crisis because this is a terrain that has been systematically devalued, disinvested, is a terrain that has been starved, in the sense that no resources has been really put at its service, that the social services that the state has provided, right, have been understaffed, so that the sanitary system, even before COVID, were always on the verge of collapse. And it was the deaths and the great destabilization that the pandemic has provoked have been really the story of a crisis that had long been in the make, that had long been announced. And I think it's important to see that. When people speak about going back to the normality, we have to say, no, there was no normality. The normality was the crisis. There's no normality. What we need to do is use the energy, the rage also that is being generated by this pandemic, to really create a movement that demand a broad structural transformation. The structural transformation that feminist movement, as well as ecological movement and other social justice movement, have been fighting for a long time, because it's the whole reproductive system. And the reproductive system that concerns not only healthcare, not only care work in the home, but also food, the food production. The food that we eat today, we don't know if it is nourishing or if it is poison, because agriculture has become so industrialized that the food that is produced out of it, it's really non-nutrition, and in many cases, it's actually more dangerous to our health. So reproduction is a is a very vast terrain with all kinds of activities. And it's very, very important that we do not concentrate only in one area, but we see the connectivity between, for example, agriculture, food production, healthcare, the kind of health or diseases that we have, and connect that, of course, also with the question of work, because work makes you sick. We have seen in the last few weeks that people were told, oh, you have to go to work, whether in many cases, whether you're sick or not. And many people have said, no, I mean, going to work kills. But this has been true even before. For example, the amount of pollution that exists in many workplaces, the amount of pollution that exists in the air. We now live more and more globally in places where we cannot breathe. I cannot breathe has become the slogan of the Black Lives Matter movement, because so many people have been suffocated by the police, have been killed, strangled, basically. And as they were being killed, they were screaming, I cannot breathe, I cannot breathe. I cannot breathe is now a scream that is coming from many, many places. It is being told that in China and other parts of Southeast Asia, they've been highly industrialized. People for the first time because of the pandemic, have seen a blue sky. We are being told that the map of the deaths often is the same map of the contamination of the air, because the contamination of the air creates lesions in the lungs, creates problems in the lungs that facilitate the entry of the virus. So the ability to breathe good air is fundamental to our reproduction. And this is becoming more and more of a luxury, in the same ways as the house is becoming of a luxury. United States, many of the main cities in the United States are becoming encampments of homeless people, because the rents have become so expensive that the house is becoming a privilege. And now people live in the street even when they have a job. All of this is connected with the crisis. All of this was a crisis already there, which I said. So to conclude, because I want to leave space to the question, it's very important that we go back to a whole history, and not just go back, but we connect, right? Both to a history of feminist organizing and to the present of feminist movement, as well as rural women's movement, indigenous women's movement, Black Lives Matter women's movement, and men's movement, because they are today demanding a structural change. They are demanding a structural change. They are bringing out that life as usual is no longer possible, that there is no normality to return to, that whatever struggle we do, we need to begin with a massive restructure of the reproductive work and our social relation. Because the social relations of sexism, racism, they represent something that is as deadly and devaluation of our life, because the devaluation of reproductive work is the devaluation of our life. The structural devaluation of our life, which is the devaluation, begins with the devaluation of reproduction, right, is as deadly as any virus. And I want to say something else again, which is that even looking specifically to the question of epidemics, we can see that if we broaden our horizon, not only beyond Europe and beyond the United States, we immediately see that for the last 40, 50 years, in particular, from Africa to Asia to Latin America, it's been a continuum of epidemics, a continuum, right? Because we have had Ebola, we have had epidemics of meningitis, epidemics of cholera, avian flu, SARS, on and on and on, Zika. So it's clear that, capitalist development and capitalist globalization really, far from spreading progress across the world, in fact, has spread epidemics and death. And this is not an exception, because actually the whole history, 500 years of history of capitalism, shows that capitalism, far from being production of justice, well-being, and progress, it's really being production of scarcity, in almost wealth for the few, but for the most, production of scarcity and really production of death. Thank you very much. So now we can have some questions. And I'm sorry that I had to rush so much in my presentation. Many things, of course, needs to be further, but I hope to have provided a framework that can stimulate some question.
Thank you so much, Silvia, for the analysis. And I also want to say to the audience again that you'll be able to write your comments and questions in the YouTube commentary section, and I can then present them to Silvia Federici. So I have prepared some questions, and I would like to ask you, in which way has the body become a signifier for the reproduction crisis the neoliberal turn in capitalist development has generated?
Well, I think just staying with the more recent time, you can see that the body, it has been said that every policy, every institutional policy, or every policy emerging from social movement is all reflected in the body. The body is a political cipher. The way people walk, for instance, from the way people walk, if your mind is politically programmed in a way, you can tell if a population is defeated or a population is in fact empowered, right? The body, now today you walk around the United States and the number of people, for instance, as a start, of people who are suffering from obesity, suffering from a clear destruction of their bodies. It's phenomenal. All this has happened in the space of a few decades, and this is one example in which a whole crisis of reproduction, the passing from somebody who could cook food, etc., to fast food, and a fast food that using ingredients that come from a industrialized, chemical, totally manipulated agriculture. All this poison that goes into the body, right? Organized basically not to nourish you, but to in fact make of you a more active consumer. So the obesity, for instance, the number of children that I mentioned before, 8 million children who are on Thorazine, they are on all different types of antidepressant, 8 million children classified as mentally ill in one form or another, hyperactive, with deficit attention at school, etc. Again, bodies that are breaking down. Women, the biggest consumers of antidepressant in the country, and suffering from constant tension and anxiety. All of these, right, are examples. And of course, black bodies today, that can be killed, can be tortured with impunity by forces that have all the power of the institution, of the government behind them, right? This is really, I think, a panorama that indicates, right, the level of crisis that we are living, of a capitalism that on one side does not provide the resources for reproduction, on the other must mobilize the maximum of repression. Because of work, of course, a dissatisfied population, a population whose reproduction, whose future is not guaranteed, is a population that, in the eyes of the state, is dangerous, ready to revolt. And so you have to keep the lead on them. You have to repress. The more exploited, the more victimized, the more you have to find ways of repressing them. And the body is at the center of both the lack of investment in our well-being, and at the center of the repressive policies that suffocate the revolt against that lack.
Mm-hmm. If you go back in history, where would you locate the capitalist transformation of the body into, as you called it, a work machine?
Well, I think that the transformation of the body as a work machine it's a continuous theme. It's a continuous theme in the history of capitalist society. Begins right away, in Caliban and the Witch. I've spoken, for example, of how the witch hunts of the 16th, 17th, 18th century were instrumental to create a whole new discipline, for women, and also how they, in fact, help to place the body of women into the hands of the state, right? For example, with the demonization of any activity, that would control procreation, the demonization of abortion, right? With the definition of female sexuality as something dangerous, subversive, they have to be channeled to very productive use, the family, marriage, servicing man, procreation, etc., etc. So they are the mechanization of the body, right? But at the same time, slavery, enslavement, has been really another major terrain for transforming, bodies into machines. And then the process of industrialization. So each phase, each transformation in the organization of work and work relation, right, has been accompanied by, because the machine has to be updated. The machine has to be updated. So in a book, I think in Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, I wrote that, for example, with the process of industrialization in the 1920s in particular, right, when you have the restructuring of the working class life, the working class family, at least in Europe and in the United States, the restructuring of the family of the wage worker, right, that you have a change, in the organization of housework. The woman is not supposed only to procreate children, but is supposed also to please sexually the man, or housework tasks for reproductive tasks are being restructured. And she expected, for instance, not only to go to bed at night and open her legs, which was, the the expectation, but actually make herself attractive, except take care of her body, being pleasing, etc. So this has been a constantly evolving process, a constant. Today we see actually, in my view, an extreme form of mechanization of the female body with surrogate mothering, right? The fact of the woman who produces children as if she were producing for the market. She produces children that in a way they have to be marketed, will be given to another family for a certain amount of money, right? And she's instructed not to become attached to them during the gestational process, right? So that you have a notion of the woman's body really as a container, right? She's the container for this child that grows, to which she's not supposed to develop any feeling, and then it's taken away. And so this is are all examples of transformation of the body into a machine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have a question from the audience by Johanna Arup. How do you imagine we solve the problem of the devaluation of reproductive labor in relation to the wage issue or monetary economic difference?
Right. Well, in my view, that's why I say that the women's movement of the 70s was limited in posing as a strategy for transformation, only entering the wage workplace. That this was a limit because, in fact, it left a whole area of work the women continued to do. All was done by migrant women. So there was no solution unless we deal with that. And dealing with that really means to find strategies that are both revaluing the work and erasing the divisions that have been built between waged and unwaged labor. I think that this, and what I've been proposing, and I proposed it out of looking at what women are already doing, not out of some abstract fantasy, but basically looking at what is the range of possibility and what these women are doing. First of all, broad movement, creating broad movement. Movement of women together with ecological, women are fighting around ecology, women are fighting around healthcare and care work, trans women, a broad movement that in a way forces the state to make a very different use of the social wealth that now they are manipulating. Today in the United States, there is as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement, there is a demand that for me is extremely important and that can be amplified. The demand is defund the police, dismantle the police, and use the huge, immense amount of money now going to the police, place it at the service of services, place it at the service of the Black community, education, healthcare, everything. That demand is what, in a way, I've been talking about for the feminist movement for a long time. Defund the military, defund all the activity for the production of death and more, and transfer that social wealth the women have also produced and move it to the service of reproduction. How that is done, what does it mean, in what forms? Money, houses, healthcare, services. This is what we have to work on. This is what we have to work on, and this has to be the product of a broad debate, can only come from a broad debate from below, so that we make sure that the kind of restructuring that is being implemented is not used to divide us, but actually is organized in a way that undermines the division. One of the dangers of the so-called reforms, or one of the dangers of the concessions that the state makes after a struggle, is that they are used to satisfy the needs of one part of the struggle, and therefore to create even more deep division. We don't want that. We have to have broad-based movement that look at how do we want to organize. But the important thing is moving the social wealth away from war, policies, killing, etc., surveillance, the militarization of everyday life, to, in fact, from death to life, from death producing activity to life affirming activity. That should be the horizon. That should be the broad scheme, the perspective shaping any movement. The other, and connected with it, is the restructuring of the way also we reproduce our life. You know, we have to break down the walls, right? Now we have all the little houses, you know, we all separated, so that the house, the place of reproduction for women, has become a jail in many cases. And today, this is another issue that the pandemic, the COVID-19, has dramatized, because many women, particularly women subject to abuse by men, by their husband, have found themselves twice as much prisoners and in danger for their life, because already the situation creates tension. And we know that the more tension in a family, the more violent the man becomes. For example, in families that have high level of debt, today there's a whole statistics that have accentuated male violence against women. So now these women trapped into the home, unable many times to reach an organization, even when their life was in danger. But this is again a crisis that has always been there, because the way we are organized reproduction in a way that individualizes us, atomizes us. So we have to find, and here too, I mean, I've written a lot about it in my work. Now it's translated into German in Vienna, you know, by Mandelao, right? Reenchanting the world, right? This book that has just been published in Austria, in Germany, called Reenchanting the World. I've spoken about my experience inspired, you know, by women in Latin America, who in the face of a reproductive crisis have begun to create new communitarian forms of reproduction that are extremely important to support their life, but also to support the struggle. Because you need to have an infrastructure. You need to have a particular reproductive infrastructure in order to continue a struggle over a long period. No, not a struggle that is, you know, just a big flame and then turns into ashes, but a struggle that sustains itself and grows over the long period. So this, I think, is what we need to do in response to that question.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you can explain more what you mean by reproductive infrastructure?
Yes,
wondering.
That's right, reproductive infrastructure. For instance, to give you an example, right? One form of struggle that a lot of women in India, in Latin America have been using has been the march, right? You march, for example, over the years, there's been a number of marches of women from the Amazon going to Quito in Ecuador, or in India from, you know, maybe 100 kilometers, weeks of walking. It's a very powerful form of struggle. You walk all together. It's something that brings women together, but also you go through villages, you go through places, you stop, you talk to people. It's an ongoing mobilization because you speak to the people that you cross. But how do you organize that? You need a whole infrastructure. The children, how do you feed them? Cleaning, some education as you're going on the street, washing, providing all of this. The fact that these are typically women's forms of struggle, to me, speaks volume. Women have been oppressed and exploited in a particularly intense way with regard to reproduction. But we have learned also something. We have learned certain things about what is necessary to reproduce lives. You know, we have learned this that makes possible, for instance, this kind of struggle that probably would not be unconceivable coming from men. But they wouldn't know how do you care for 2 months on the road with children. We have seen it, you know, in Standing Rock in Dakota, the struggle of the Lakota people in the United States, fighting against the construction of a pipeline. It was women who called themselves water defenders, the defenders of the water, because the river was going to be contaminated by fracking, you know, and they organized the camp, up to 7,000 people. So organize everything, you know, 7,000 people in the cold, in the bitter winter cold. And that means, that's what I mean by infrastructure. Infrastructure means you have to figure out food, you have to figure out cleaning, you have to figure out cultural activities, particularly for the children, somebody who care work for the children. You have to figure out, you know, clothing. It's a broad structure. And of course, all the psychological, emotional work. Reproduction is also psychological, emotional work, because that's perhaps the most important in a way, you know, so that people do not feel depressed or hostile to each other. Tension creates hostility. All the work that women have done, resolving the crisis of the family, making sure that everything would be okay, explaining to one what the other means. This is a huge amount of work. Somehow, that exploitation has also created, people learn even from the way in which they are exploited. And I think there's been a learning, which is why reproduction has become a huge issue for women's movement. You know, whereas men have thought about, you know, organizing around the wage workplace. But in reality, there shouldn't be a separation between the two, because the question of reproduction is also a question of, you know, an auto factory, a chemical factory. Why should we produce things that are destructive of our life? Why should we produce chemicals that are going into our bodies? You know, so this is what I mean by an infrastructure. I mean to create a condition under which people can reproduce daily in our life, and at the same time, in ways that brings them together and enhances solidarity. Reproduction is one aspect. The other is reproduction in a way that creates community, in a way that instead of separating us, brings us together.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe one more question that is connected to especially what we just witnessed about the solidarity. In your book, Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, you also just mentioned rethinking.
Yes, it has resonates now with what is happening.
It does. Rethinking, remaking, and reclaiming the body in contemporary capitalism. You reflect on the different manifestations of the body as a ground of confrontation with the state and a vehicle for transformative social practices.
Right.
Do you see a change through the solidarity between different ethnicities and other groups that we can witness in the Black Lives Matter movement right now?
Yeah, I think a major change, and this has been noticed by everybody. For instance, in the United States, half of the demonstration in response to the killing of George Floyd and many other, because there have been other killings before and after, even during the protest, in fact, every day now, and this protest is not going to end anyway soon. In fact, it's a protest that has broad implication, and I think is going to actually grow and not fade away. Something very important. And one important element is also the wide participation of white youth and white people in general. There have been demonstrations actually in which the majority were white people, not all by any means, but the white people's presence has been continuous all throughout. This is new. This is very new. And I think, it's one of the most promising aspects, because it shows that the kind of division, the kind of mechanism of division that have been so powerful in the past are not active, are not as possible any longer. And I think here too, as with the protest of Black people in general, the experience of the COVID has accentuated, the outrage that was felt in front of the assassination of George Floyd, because we have seen that the epidemic has shown not only all the crises of reproduction that I've talked about pre-existing the pandemic, but it's also shown the inequalities, of this society. 80% of those who have died, in New York and other places have been Black people, as well also many older people, who basically have been in publicly funded nursing homes. But the racial character, of the disease and the number of people who have been killed have brought many to say we have two viruses, the COVID-19 and racism. Racism is the most dangerous pre-existing condition for people. We talk about pre-existing condition, where racism is the most dangerous of all. So this certainly has added to the anger, the pain, of Black people manifested in the protest. But also in the case of white youth, we have a white youth who is full of debt. Over the last 2-3 decades, a lot of young people, particularly working class level, have seen whatever hopes they have for the future, being shut down. And not to the extent, of their peers in the Black community, but they too. And what happened with COVID, has shown, has added fuel to this sense that for them too, in a different way, there is no future. So these protests, have brought together, the sense of this system is not working. We have to do something because this system is killing us. This system is a system that is structurally unjust, structurally built on division and on injustice. That you can have police week after week after week killing people, disarmed for the most futile reason, with total impunity. At best, they move them from one job to the next. is something else. But I think already this movement, and partly is also because of the participation of so many white people, is beginning to change something. We have things happening that I did not imagine would be possible in the short term. In Minneapolis, the city council, the local government, is now talking about dismantling the police, finding other alternatives. In many other cities, there's a talk about defunding the police or moving some of the money at the social services and putting the money now dedicated to the police, putting it at the service of services in the Black community. In Seattle, we have youth who have taken over 6 blocks of the city and called it an autonomous zone, declare it a space where the police will not go, and organize all kinds of activities, a beautiful, beautiful anticipation of the future, of a different future. Trump is planning to send the military. He keeps saying it every day. But the autonomous zones go on. And yesterday there was something that is quite shocking. The Supreme Court of the United States, the most conservative court that has been in a long time, has legislated that it is illegal for employers to discriminate on the basis of sexual preference, and is illegal to discriminate against LGBTQ people. This is an amazing victory, particularly if you think that these all the majority of the Supreme Court people have been appointed by Trump. And why this decision? I think it would not have been possible except for the fantastic mobilization that we have seen that are not ending. In many ways, it looks like it's just beginning. Mm-hmm. In many ways, it keeps growing. Yesterday, for instance, and Sunday was used. Sunday in this square live, which is a huge, huge square. I mean, it's a big place. There were more than 15,000 people to protest the killing of 2 Black trans women. And then there was another huge demonstration by all people in the different Caribbean communities. And so in a way, it keeps actually growing. So it's a moment that I think represents a turning point. Certainly a major step ahead. Of this, I have no doubt.
I think this is a very...
And it's global, yeah. And it's global.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, the struggle here is giving power to anti-racist movement, across the world. And this, I think, is also something very, very unique and very important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you so much, Silvia. This was very, very delighting, and also I think your last words are also in a way very encouraging also for the young people here in Vienna. There were also like 50,000 people on the street, which was amazing.
Yes. Beautiful.
So, yes, and thank you so much for your lecture. And thank you also Eva Maria Stadler from the Angewandte, and also Jakob for his technical support. And yeah, I wish you all a nice evening or a nice day. And yes, all the best to New York, and all the best to you. Thank you, Silvia.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you to all those who are listening to us. And basically a great a great hug. I wish a big global embrace, because we need all our strengths together. Stay well.
Yes, you too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.